Hey, good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. We're in video number 15 of our study of the prophets in the parables. And if you're just joining us, we have been focusing in this series on how Jesus, in his parables, draws from the prophets and applies the context and the history and the characters of those Old Testament passages, radically redefines them, and applies them to his first century eschatological generation. In other words, Jesus in his parables through the prophets is telling the story, the climax to the story of Israel's last days salvation and judgment at the coming of the King to Zion. It is absolutely beautiful. Over and over and over, we've seen in the parables of Jesus that he is telling the same story through different images for sure, but nonetheless, he is telling the same story. That is the story of the salvation and the judgment of Israel in Israel's last days, which Jesus is interpreting to be in his generation, and he himself is bringing about both this salvation and judgment. Now, the same is true in Matthew 21, of course. We all know this parable. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the parable itself. The first thing I want to do is I want to make the obvious connection to Matthew 21 and the parable of the Vineyard, its primary Old Testament source, which is Isaiah chapter 5. Isaiah chapter 5, Isaiah told a parable himself of the Lord's vineyard, where Isaiah prophesied the judgment of Judah and Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians for their failure as the Lord's vineyard to produce a fruitful and a righteous harvest. They had been given everything possible by the Lord. The Lord had planted them in a fertile land. He had provided a hedge around them, a wall and a tower. In other words, he had protected them. He had provided for them. He had given them the blessings of the covenant, but they still had failed to produce a harvest of justice and righteousness. Instead, they had produced nothing but rotten grapes and unfruitful and a faithless harvest. The same thing applies in Jesus' generation, as Jesus, as we've said, draws from Isaiah chapter 5. The Jews of Jesus' generation were no better. They too have been given all the blessings, and in the person of Christ, they had experienced the fulfillment of prophecy. They had experienced the healings, signs, miracles, wonders. Yet they too had failed to produce a harvest of righteousness. They had rejected the Son, rejected his kingdom, and they were about to kill him and once and for all be cast off at the coming of the Lord. Now, that's not really what I want to focus on. That is just a primary allusion that Jesus is obviously bringing out in this parable. I want to focus on the latter portion of this parable and Jesus' stone prophecies. Between Matthew 21, 42 through 45, as we'll see, I believe Jesus draws from at least four Old Testament sources. And just like we've seen through his symbolic acts, through the parable of the two sons that just followed, Jesus, through these allusions, continues to tell the story of Israel's rejection and their destruction at the coming of the Lord. And don't forget, through all of that, he is also telling the story of Israel's last days salvation. Now watch this. Let's read Matthew 21, 42 through 45. We'll make some connections, and that's basically where we're going to end at tonight. Matthew 21, beginning in verse 42. Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone? This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it." In other words, a people that will produce a harvest of righteousness. "He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whoever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." When the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking of them. And as we've mentioned, based upon all of everything that Jesus has mentioned and what has gone before, there is no question that they truly understood he spoke this parable of them. Jesus had performed three symbolic actions: the triumphal entry, his overthrow of the temple, and his cursing of the fig tree. All of those actions prophesied primarily the judgment and overthrow of the temple and nation in their generation. Not only that, Jesus had told the parable of the two sons in the context, remember, of the ministry and the baptism of John, telling them that those who had rejected John's baptism were about to be judged. And then we come to this parable where Jesus again draws from Isaiah 5, and the obvious application is that Judah and Jerusalem were about to repeat the sin of Israel of old and be judged in their generation. But Jesus, once again, as I've said, draws in these few verses from several Old Testament prophets, which once again tell the story of Israel's climactic, eschatological judgment, and amidst that judgment, their salvation. So here's where we have. Here is what I believe the Old Testament sources for Matthew 21:42 through 45. In Matthew 21:42, where Jesus says, "The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Jesus was drawing from both Psalm 118:22 and 23, and Isaiah 28, verse 16. Then, in Matthew 21:44, where Jesus says, "And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." In that passage, Jesus was drawing from and alluding to both Isaiah 8:14 through 15, and Daniel chapter 2, verses 34 through 35 and 44. So, beginning next video, we're going to dive in one at a time into these Old Testament sources where Jesus draws from in these verses. And again, we're going to see that Jesus is bringing into his first century generation and historical situation the context and the themes that are present in those parables. He's radically redefining the characters, and he is communicating once again to his last days generation that judgment and salvation is knocking at their door. And those who put their trust in this stone will be saved. Those who don't will be judged and destroyed, and the kingdom of God will be taken away from them. That's all for tonight. We'll pick it up next time on Answers on Eschatology. Don't miss this. We are going to make some powerful connections and eschatological applications in Jesus' parables from those Old Testament prophets. We'll see you next time. Have a fantastic weekend, and God bless. Bye for now.